Good evening. Welcome to iNN's Headlines and Beyond for March 26th. It's just after the weekend, and while there was some goings on the weekend, usually as per usual, things were relatively quiet. I think everyone sort of takes the weekend off and relaxes a little bit. So that being said, we'll go on with the news for today and what was in the headlines and goals. And as usual, we will make every effort to peer behind these headlines because a large chunk of what you need to know of what actually drives these headlines is hidden, is not brought up in the news, and the only place that you're going to get it from is here. Because we look at all the sources. I'm now up to close to 30 different sources that I look at, and this is why it does take me a bit of time to come to the news desk and bring this out to you here, because I do have to look through so many different sources, and then I have to start whittling things down for the evening's broadcast to present it in the most concise and appropriate manner, so we can understand things. So in this case, what we do is we're going to start with domestic policy, the way I outlined on Thursday's broadcast, Thursday's headline and beyond. I said that we're going to start looking at things from a more geopolitical thing. There's first going to be domestic policy, and then there's going to be foreign policy. Domestic policy is considered to be, from my perspective, the policy and the perspective of the news here, the policy that's driven by the United States, and this is because the United States is so internationally powerful. Its influence is literally everywhere in the world, and a lot of this foreign policy is driven by its domestic policy and how people in the United States view the rest of the world. So if you're a foreign national and you want to know what drives American foreign policy, you need to take a look at the domestic policy and see how that shapes out. And that way you can sort of, if Israel has sort of figured out, and a lot of different we'll call PACs, the political affairs committees, have figured this out, and they know how to set up groups and organizations inside the United States and drive policy, foreign policy, American foreign policy, from within the United States, not from outside. And that's your best bet to drive international policy, is to get inside the United States, have a political affairs group, do your groundwork inside your grassroots work inside the United States, and push and drive American policy from there. And once you have that, then you can now push on to the more international into the international stages. This being said, we're now looking at once again over the weekend. We saw the marches for Trayvon Martin increase. It's gone way out of control. They're even now, the new Black Panthers has arisen. It's not that they've arisen. They're sort of, call them back from the dead, because they're basically the same as they were back in the 1970s, and they are a more radical alliance, of particularly for black people, than other groups that are out there. And I think what's happened now is that and this is where the United States really sort of needs to really move on with its racial understanding of things, is that this is sort of being framed in the media as a black and white thing. And if you sit down and take a look at the events on the ground, this wasn't a black or white thing. Even if George Zimmerman was legally correct, what had happened is, and this is sort of true across a large chunk of policing authority, that there is a training of security to be intimidating and to be threatening. And this doesn't do well when you're getting into a confrontational situation in terms of trying to dial back the violence or make sure that it doesn't go to the point where someone gets shot. So what happens is, while I say that while maybe the shooting of Trayvon Martin was preventable, was legal, it certainly was preventable. And I think this is where we should be looking at now, is how to prevent future tragedies such as this case that we have here. But the thing, at the same time, is you can't ignore the fact that, and this is something that the black community has to deal with, is the number of people who end up in prison. The number of black men who end up in prison. And basically what happens, Trayvon, believe it or not, is part of the statistics that befall black men. But and here's the thing, people want to say, oh, they're African American. But the thing is, I know Africans from Africa, and up here in Toronto. And the Africans who are directly from Africa, recently from Africa, they're not Americans. They're not American-born the way the blacks are. They don't want anything to do with the black Americans. And they want this sort of divide between the two. Most of the Africans that I know here are like any other immigrant group. They come here with nothing. They, within a few years, work to have a nice store, a house, and a fairly nice life. And they're all very hardworking people. But this, unfortunately, isn't reflected in the black community, which has stated, has broken families, has a lot of social problems that have even been pointed out to them when some of these people have gotten into these the Silicon Valley. They went to this sort of these mentorships about how to set up your Silicon Valley company. And they were approached by an Indian who says, yeah, and I'm not talking about a native, I'm talking about the original Indians from India, who basically come out and said, yeah, you and I are both colored, we both, are discriminated against. The big difference between the two of us is, I'm not willing to sit there and let someone say no, do anything about it. I'll go out and create my own job. And this is how a lot of people who end up in business because someone says no to a particular job, and rather than saying, oh, well, and walking away and feeling oppressed, that you just simply go up and start your own business and you employ yourself. So if someone's not going to employ you, you get up and you start employing yourself. This was the attitude of the United States pre-1960s. In the 1960s, once you start having the hippie movement and a lot of this socialist movement that came into the United States, they brought in the concept of a welfare state where the state sits back, where the state takes care of you, and it fostered the idea that you don't have to do anything in life. That the government will sit there, they'll provide you with job X, Y, and Z, and you'll live a happy hunky-dory life. But the problem is, this isn't reality. Everyone, to some degree, whether you're woman, man, colored, Greek, Indian, Middle Eastern, Muslim, Christian, whatever you are, you always face trials and tribulations in your life. You always face discrimination. Because you always face people who don't have the same ideas that you have. And this is, and just because someone doesn't have your ideas doesn't necessarily mean they have to like your ideas, and certainly they don't have to pay for your ideas. But yet, this is exactly what's expected in socialism. Socialism, which is highly intellectual, believes that all ideas should be accepted and then paid for. And this is not reality, because where's this money coming from? You ask a socialist, they say, oh, this thing should be paid for. Well, ask them, where? Where does this money? Who pays for this? Oh, the government pays for this. Really? That answer tells you right there that they have no idea where their money is coming from. And this is the unfortunate result of what we're seeing today in terms of the Trayvon case, is that we're seeing a lot of the American dysfunction starting to show out and play out in the American media, because you're seeing a lot of this black state oppression, which doesn't exist in the immigrant population. The immigrants don't have the same sense of oppression that a black person does, and yet the immigrant comes in just as poor as the black person starts off, and yet when where they end up is completely different. The black person will start off poor and stay poor and will continue on with generations of people on welfare. The immigrant will come in and create a whole generation, a whole society that started off poor but then grew into wealth and prosperity. And this is completely lost on American society. American society still, to this day, even though it's primarily an immigrant nation, doesn't understand the immigrant. And this is particularly true in domestic politics and domestic policy. Domestic policy in the United States right now is still pretty white. It is still very waspish. It is still very much European white-centered. And a large chunk of this problem is that even the socialists who come up and say they want to support black rights don't have an understanding of the immigrants. They don't understand how immigrants come in and they prosper without the government's help. This is completely beyond the average socialist, the average leftist. And you see this on any of their programs, that this sense of immigrant independence, which is really American independence. I mean, Americans' concept of individual independence is really embodied in the independent-minded immigrant. Because this is what the ideal American is supposed to be, this. And yet, we see on both sides of the aisle, both Republican and the Democrat, a turning away from this. There's a fear, a xenophobia of the ideal American immigrant. Right? This sort of closed model is feared rather than being embraced. And as I haven't seen the Republican Party yet, or anyone in the Republican Party, properly address this issue. And the only saving grace right now the Republican Party has going for it, and the only reason why I would say to vote for the Republican, is if they keep the government small, you can then set up a political action committee to then steer the American government towards a more humane stance. Where you can't do this with the Democrats, because Democrats believe that everything needs to be done by the government, and as soon as the government sets up, these opposition groups, these independent political groups, have to shut down because they're not the government. You either conform to the government under the Democrats and socialism, or you're eliminated. That's the room you have to work with the Democrats. If you have a Republican situation in there, a Republican government in there, because they are more lax on the government side, they don't have as many government people in there. They want to get rid of more of the government. They want to have a small government, and we keep them to this, and we keep them to their promise of small government. Then it allows for a lot more independent groups to get in there and have their own say. And that's what American politics is not something that should be a spectator sport. You should be thinking about getting involved, about how to change things in your society, how to change things in your community. So if you see someone, a kid being arrested for selling a lemonade, and this has happened in the United States, then you need to start looking seriously at the politicians who put these laws in, and state to them the next time that the election comes around, you pull this up and say, we're not voting for you. If you start turfing out politicians for their violations of American freedoms and the ideals of freedoms, and this is something that the immigrants embody, you'll start to see the politicians change. They'll respond to them. But if we sit there and do nothing and go, oh, well, that's politicians for you. They're all crooked. They're all, lousy. They're all liars. Then what's going to happen is that they're going to get used to this, and they'll simply say, well, this is all they're going to do, all the public is going to do is whine about it, but they're not actually going to do anything about it. And this is how you lose your freedom. And so now we're seeing this whole argument of Obamacare come up. And again, you've got the both sides on there. And we hear people say, oh, we shouldn't socialize our medicine. We're fine the way we are now. And you have the other side say, oh, we need to have health care for everybody. Everybody needs health care. We need to to pay for it. It's inhumane not to have this. But the argument, I'm going to leave the right alone for a while now on this one here, because the left has an opportunity that it just simply didn't use. The failure of healthcare, since it was a left issue in terms of universal healthcare, is really a failure of the left and the failure of socialism. And it's not really an issue that you can sort of blame and put on the Republicans because it's not their issue. It's just simply not their issue. What had happened, and this is what, and I talked to my dad about this, and he's an older person. He remembers the old medical systems in the United States, and in many cases all around. This was similar around the world. That as a kid, his family was poor, and lived in these the government housing and stuff like that. He grew up in the poor neighborhoods of Boston. His doctor was the father of Dukakis. I think it's George Dukakis. I can't remember what the first name is, but he was a Dukakis. Anyways, he was the one who ran for president of the Democrats. One of these a couple of years ago, and telling me how the doctor would do house visits and wouldn't charge. They'd visit the house, they'd do a checkup, they'd give them their medication, and nothing would be charged. And then recently, if you go back and see what's happening now, and doctors can't do that anymore. And you say, well, why can't a doctor do what Dr. Dukakis had done? Why can't doctors do what had been done before? And the reason is liability issues. The doctors have been sued so much by these trial lawyers who are ironically Democrats. The Democrats are primarily trial lawyers. They're the ones who pushed up malpractice insurance to a point where doctors could no longer treat patients for free out of fear of being sued. This is basically free health care in the United States was sued out of existence by the Democrats. So now the Democrats are up there saying, oh, we need to bring in health care. Well, wait a minute here. You had free health care, but you got rid of it. Now you want free health care again? And the thing is, here's the problem is that the people who are supporting the free health care, the Democrats, if you look at the people who support them, this includes Mark Rich of Royal Dutch Shell. This includes George Soros, he's a multi-billionaire. He's a world financier who does a lot of trading on the stock market. He's one of the biggest hedge fund managers around. There's Warren Buffett, who is the Oracle of Omaha. There's Bill Gates, and then on the lower levels on the lower ranks of the ladder, there's Oprah, Barbara Streisand. I mean, these people, when you look at the Hollywood wealth that they have, and the amount of wealth that's on the Democrat side, they could have privately if all these people didn't mind, say, as they say, didn't mind paying a little extra, could have financed an entirely free healthcare system for every single American in the United States. But they didn't do this. So healthcare and Obamacare is a Democrat, a socialist failure. And yet this analysis is completely lost on the Republicans. Republicans don't seem to know how to really argue that the Democrats had universal health care but suited out of existence. And then when it comes up again to do this, rather than paying for themselves with the resources they easily could have done this, chose not to. So the lack of health care that exists in the United States, in the state of health care that exists in the United States, as it exists right now, is an issue and the fault of the Democrats. And because Obama is president, it's his fault. He needs to take this blame and say, well, I failed in my presidency to properly bring in health care. And why? He had Obama. He had Oprah. He had Bill Gates. He had Warren Buffett. He had George Soros. He had all these people who had billions of dollars. And a lot of the associations, like the American Medical Association, the American Heart Association, the American Stroke Association, all these medical groups all wanted health care. All these organizations, these charities, have billions in the bank. Yet none of them stepped forward to pay a dime for our American healthcare system, for a free American healthcare system. And he didn't ask them to either. I mean, if you're there saying, I want to set up a healthcare system, you want to put it together, and you have all these people around you with all this money, and go, I wonder where we're going to get the money from, and you have no idea where to get the money from, and you have all these wealthy people in front of you who are your supporters, and you can't figure out where you're going to get the money from? And this guy is a Harvard graduate? Think about this for a minute. This guy is a Harvard graduate. He is considered to be leagues above George Bush, in terms of George W. Bush, in terms of his intellect. And yet this guy, in a room full of billionaires, couldn't find the money for health care. Think about this for a minute. And I hope, Romney, whoever's out there, if any Republican who can get this to any of the candidates, point this out. You had Obama there in a room full of billionaires and billionaire supporters and he couldn't figure out how to get health care paid for. This is a monumental failure of domestic policy by Obama. And of course, now it's up at the Supreme Court, and they're trying to decide whether the law is constitutional or unconstitutional. And it's unconstitutional because, as I said, Obama had and has the ability to pay for it. He's got the resources. He just simply has no idea that, or even thinks that these resources should be used. I said, so Obamacare is Obama's failure. He should know what's around him. He should know the resources that he has. And at this point, we are going to head over to the second half of Headlines and Beyond. So I will see you in 2 minutes. I will see you on the other side.